Heck of a week, Zach, huh?
You even got an earthquake yesterday.
That's right. Salt Lake had its first in many years, 5.7.
I have a weird suspicion what's going to come out of this earthquake and then the one up in Alaska.
What's
The
that?
structural engineering community is going to be that the veneer attachment of brick the brick attachment needs to be engineered. I just think it's going to be a thing because too many buildings with brick falling off of it or brick failing.
Yeah, that was the only thing I saw walking around yesterday. My firm and many firms in the area did do a walk around following the guidelines of ATC 20. Yeah, there were some veneer failures, but not that many. I did a stroll of downtown early in the morning right after the earthquake, and only a few instances of things falling, mostly kind of parapets and chimneys.
Did you scooter?
No, I don't want to touch anything.
Dang it.
Yeah.
Well, that's probably a good idea, but the earthquake, the bad one we had about a year and a half ago up in Alaska, we've talked about on the podcast before, a lot of the brick veneer failed in such a manner that would block exits or fallen on people. And looking at the pictures, at least I saw yesterday from Salt Lake, it was somewhat similar. Those old unreinforced masonry buildings, a lot of the parapets kind of came off. Mm-hmm. Chimneys were falling. Some huge cracking in some veneer, some masonry.
Oh, veneer.
Yeah. And it just made me think, how far should we take it, you think, on designing of that in seismic regions?
Yeah, I agree that maybe restraint of brick veneer above doors could be something that's engineered. As far as, we saw a lot more of that in Alaska. As far as what I saw last night, it was only the older buildings.
Well, that's good.
It was, yeah, and very, nothing substantial. Yeah. Pretty small. It was a very quick earthquake, a few seconds, it felt like. I think we're at least at 60 or 70 aftershocks. There was one good one in the 4 range, but even, comparing a 4.6, I think it was, to a 5.7, we know that the amplitude is 10 times different. The energy is 32 times. Like it was a lot lighter. So, that's all we've gotten.
Yeah. So another successful day in the engineering world. No buildings came down and we continue living. Yeah. This episode that we have recorded is pre-recorded. We did this one a couple weeks ago, and I'd say it's probably one of our most lighthearted episodes. But we figured we'd throw in a little extra introduction here, and we hope you guys enjoy this one. It has nothing to do with anything that's going on. It's about Bim.
Oh, geez. That's how good they were. I don't know. What do you think about that metal? Nails through concrete. Fairly excited. Was it the Structural Engineering Podcast?
Welcome to this week's episode of the Structural Engineering Podcast. My name is Max.
And I'm Zach.
And this week we're talking about BIM, Building Information Modeling, CAD, what software is used, who's using which when, where's the industry going, and all sorts of things like that. Zach, what do you think about something?
Max, I've got lots of thoughts, so I need you to be a little more specific on what question you're asking here.
Let's start with what you use day to day and the most common. But what do you draft? What do you draft in?
Revit all day, every day is Revit. Actually, and more or less my whole career, the last 4.5 years, has only been in Revit.
Yeah, and that's kind of how it just is now, huh?
Yeah, I've got to say, all my friends that work in the structural engineering industry, I don't think I know of anyone that's in CAD, maybe for some small projects or miscellaneous tasks, but in general, they're definitely all in Revit. I know there's a couple other softwares out there that are being used, but I'd say for the majority of people I know, architects, structural engineers, mechanical, electrical, everyone's in this Revit software.
Yeah, I agree. What do you think about, I know you haven't done homes really ever much. I used to do some residential houses, and I think that's probably the slowest to get there. There's just really not the fee, I think, to be in Revit until you're so dialed, that it's takes the same amount of time, right? Right now, I think that Revit is a little harder, a little more of an endeavor. If you're doing small residential projects, I think that's a lot to ask to be in Revit at the moment. I don't know if that's the way it'll always be.
I agree. It probably is quite the task to fully draft, and again, depends on what level of modeling you're going to produce for a house in Revit. But I would say long term, I would think, and this is something I think we'll really get into in this episode, but everything's going to this BIM, this building information modeling, and that's really what this Revit and this 3D stuff is doing. It's allowing you to communicate together quicker and better. On the construction side, it's doing tons of stuff. I mean, think about it. 15, 20, 30 years ago, a contractor could never pull up a 3D view of a building while they're trying to build it or try to understand it. Looking at things in 2D can sometimes be really challenging, especially when the situation becomes pretty difficult and complex.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're saying, BIM as sort of the thing that's standard now. And I think a lot of people that maybe been in the industry for a while probably are checking out because they're like, yeah, this is the standard for, quite a while now. I took BIM in college 12 years ago, right? So this isn't really new anymore. The reason that we're talking about this a little bit, right, is, well, one, we had a great question online, just interested in the topic. But then there was also a report that I read basically saying that engineers are still reluctant to really use BIM in their design, right? We treat it as if...
It's pretty funny. When we talked to Carl a little bit, he discussed this a tiny bit. I don't know if it made it into that episode, but on the mechanical engineering side, they almost use, with Revit, they almost use it as a design software as much as a modeling software, and they model everything in that. So I feel like that side of the industry is really taking it on.
Yeah, and something on the structure side just seems to be lacking, and it's we treat it as if it's a CAD software, and it is. If you say that our deliverable is a piece of paper, then there is no reason to use Revit. I mean, right? Like you can use it for clash detection. That's great. And that's, the only reason to keep a well-working Revit model. I know there are so many instances where people will fake a Revit to make sure that it looks right on the paper, fully knowing that it's completely wrong in the model. Right.
The only other benefit I'd say is if you can go between your structural modeling software and Revit, interchange. Risa does that. Bentley Ram does that as well. I think that would be your only other benefit to doing, if your only deliverable was the model and you're using that type of software, your only deliverable was drawings and you're using that type of software, Revit does a really good job working back and forth with those.
Yeah, absolutely. So how good are you at Revit? Are you the man? Can you do project front to start? Coordinate the heck out of it? Dodge those ducks?
Are we talking speed or accuracy here?
Accuracy. At a profitable speed.
I would say I'm okay. I definitely enjoy getting in Revit, updating things, and cutting a lot of sections for coordination and going through the model. I spend a lot of time in the model more or less working through the coordination elements a lot more than I spend necessarily modeling in it.
That's sort of one of the problems, right, is that we're not really well trained with Revit, generally speaking. And I think a lot of engineers maybe don't get into it. Like you're saying, you enjoy it. It's, I really like the detailing part, and I think that's super fun. Whether you're in Revit or CAD, it's the same thing because, right, we're not detailing in 3D elements necessarily. But there's a lot that is just like commonly not done. Like this detailing can all be live sections, can be totally real.
Right. Yeah, and I think live sections have their place. I don't ever use them, but I get the understanding of you load in a new architectural model and everything shifted, you'd see it, but that could also be a big problem. So one thing I think is a big thing in the industry, and kind of the question that was brought up to us on Instagram a little bit too was like, why is there this weird change from CAD to Revit, from 2D to 3D and this BIM stuff, this building information modeling, and is it being quickly adopted? Is it kind of slow? And the funny thing is, Max, you and I more or less use it every day, and you kind of brought up with the house designers, maybe there's an industry out there that's not really using it much. But I think it's such an interesting topic of why we're even talking about it.
Yeah. It's really valuable. I think a good exercise maybe is to think about what construction is probably going to look like in 50 years, right? 3D printing is becoming a bigger thing. I think, virtual design and construction is going to become a bigger player. And all of these things are so clearly linked to building information modeling that it's just, you can't, shy away from it, I think.
I think everything's got to go to design build with BIM.
Yeah. I mean, to me, that's the smoothest. Hold on. So before we just complain about this, what is BIM? Besides information modeling software, what makes Revit BIM and 3D CAD not?
So the best definition I found is that BIM is a digital representation of physical and functional characteristics of a facility. It's the shared knowledge resource for information about a facility, forming a reliable basis of decisions during its life cycle. So it's through the whole idea of through concept to, you could take this all the way through demolition. If you had a building that was built, let's say tomorrow, and in 50 years they want to demo it, and there's a BIM model, you could better understand and figure out what you're going to do to demolish the building than just jumping right into it.
Absolutely. So yeah, the requirement of a BIM model, we would tend to say like CAD is not and Revit is, but to actually be BIM, you have to include information about the parameters in the model. So, you will say this is a steel beam and it's shaped like this, not just a wood beam that happens to be a W, and way deeper than that, obviously. You can have all of the characteristics of a mechanical unit, whatever that is. Power, I don't know. So the reasons to use BIM, there's a ton, obviously. What are some of the ones you like, Zach?
To me, it's coordination all day, every day. I feel like currently out in the field, they're using 2D drawings to build things. And so our true deliverable is that. But I really, really believe we're getting better buildings that are more highly coordinated. And there's always a negative side to all of this. But I think there also might be going too quick and trying to use these technologies to do things faster could also be maybe a little bit of a downside. You only said what I like, though, so I'm not going to go into that. To me, really, it's just the coordination. I do like it that you can, draw things and, again, it just goes back to coordination. You draw things, other people load it into their model, and then it allows them to ask better questions. And that, to me, is what all this is about, is how can you ask better, more well-informed questions?
Absolutely. There's a nice list that we've got from the internet here, and figure it might be fun to go through a couple and see what you think. So we've been harping on number 1 from the list, actually, which is better collaboration. Number 2 we've got is model-based cost estimation, right? You can get a way clearer picture of the actual building when you have all of the information already in a model, right? This is, instead of doing your takeoffs by measuring all the beams and figure out how heavy they are, Revit can just tell you. You don't have to do anything. That doesn't really affect the structural side. Probably it would hurt us because then when we change something, it's a little clearer.
Direct cost goes up. Who did it?
Yeah.
Max Loeb.
Yeah. Who changed this beam? And then, a number of things in that venue, like reduce costs, mitigated risk, improve scheduling and sequencing, increase productivity. They even, say safer construction sites, better builds. I think a lot of that is accurate. Maybe it's just stretching a little bit, but there's really a lot to this stuff.
The list, I feel like, can go on forever. And maybe I'm pushing this way too much, but I keep coming up with this idea, not idea, but to me, it's so blatant. On every Max, pretty much everything we've ever talked about on this podcast comes down to communication. The failures of communication. All BIM is really, really trying to do is to make that flow better. If you think about it, if they can do live cost estimating as we're changing things, they're not necessarily going to be like, oh, Max changed a beam, but they can see that price fluctuate as it goes. And at the end of the day, whatever you have on your drawings is what the building needs to be built with. It's irrelevant if you went from a W12 one day to the W40 the next day, because that's what the building required.
So I have a question for you. and we've talked about this a number of times, but I think the answer in this episode is going to be different than on other episodes. What is our product?
Well, it's so dependent now on the client. And this brings up exactly what you're alluding to, is that our true, in the truest sense of structural engineering, is a 2D set of drawings, of paper drawings. But as things are developing, as BIM has come out into the whole world and ecosystem of construction, including architecture and all the engineering disciplines and sub consultants and all that kind of stuff, it's really coming to have to be more than drawings. And in this case, I think clients are starting to look more and more to this BIM modeling, especially the architect, so they can really understand how their system is working with our system, right? How do we collaborate together? So I think now, and seeing all these articles, what it's really coming down to is how well can you define your scope of work, and that's been an interesting topic within the BIM world, is what levels expected, what level of modeling is expected by different consultants. And a lot of times it's not very well defined. So it does lead to a lot of frustrations. And for instance, do you model your gusset plates on your brace frames?
No.
Exactly. A lot of architects, a lot of contractors want to see that because that helps with clash detection. What's coming out of this to me is that you just need to have more understanding with your client what they expect, and then to meet those expectations. And the nice thing is, once you lay out these expectations, you can get a better fee, or you can more well define your fee to be happy with what you got and the product you produce.
Absolutely. One of the things that I saw, and this is actually SEAC, so Structural Engineering Association of Colorado, put out a survey a couple years ago. And they were asking what BIM means to you. And they were asking structural engineers this. And one of the things was someone just whining about how it's more work for the consultant, right? Like, what BIM means to this guy is that he has to do more. And it had me thinking, realistically, are we doing more as an industry than we did 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30? Let's go back to kind of where computers, I was talking to someone in the office today about computers in the early 80s, when he would have to bring his punch cards up to the university to run a matrix, and how awesome that is. But yeah, like we're able to design way, way faster, way more efficiently. And I think the argument that we are required to do more, I don't buy it. I don't know.
I don't either. And I've told you this story before, is one of the principals I used to work for, said, back in the 80s, take a 2-story building, take weeks to design it, all the beams, just the beams for the building, or the framing for the building. And nowadays, you build a 3D model, let's say my favorite software, RAM, and you just hit go. I mean, for a 2-story building, let's just say a 2-story box, I mean, that could easily just take a day to model and design, and at least get all your elements sized. So there's things like that on the design side that are being sped up. More complex projects, I mean, you're really designing more the detailing than the major framing a lot of times, is that those programs are really taking over that brunt of things. But I don't think we're necessarily at all asking to do more. I think it's just different, and I think that's where the industry is really being held up on.
Yeah, I think the role will always evolve, and to think it's not fair or it's not the way it's always been. Well,
do you think back in the day it went from hand drawings, from the gap from, or the jump from hand drawings to CAD? Do you think this kind of had the same negative approach, or kind of people are hesitant to jump to CAD after, drawing by hand?
I don't know. I'd like to say no, but I think history would tell us that the answer is probably yes.
I would agree with that.
I think it seems now like so obviously so much easier, but I'm sure that people, when I was an architect, or working as an architect, I once heard someone talk about, and this is kind of still early-ish in the Revit days. An architect was telling me that when they switched to CAD, all the buildings became very CAD-like. It was like you would array things, you would offset things, and they became more geometric to him. And he was saying he isn't quite sure what Revit-like is, but he's pretty sure that the buildings of the early 2000s are all going to be Revit-like, whatever that is. That's not something that I have ever recognized. but I see where he's coming from.
Yeah, and that brings up a good point. To me, history, and to I think most people, history always tends to repeat itself. And I bet that you're totally right. There probably was a big pushback on doing CAD from hand drawings, and there's probably a good reason at the time people had. I bet that's exactly what we're doing now, pushing back. And to me and to our audience, I think if you guys really approached BIM and Revit and everything like that with a more positive attitude, you're definitely going to find clients are a lot happier. You're going to just go further because in the next 5 to 10 years, it's going to be the thing, if not the only thing, that's being used. And so definitely grasp onto the trends like that, as they're really not going anywhere. What I thought was interesting was the top 3 softwares that are being used for drafting drawings. And I think this will tell you kind of where things are sitting. So number 1 was Revit at 46%. Number 2 was AutoCAD and AutoCAD LT at 24%. And then in third place was ArchiCAD at 15%, which I have absolutely no clue what that is. And I'm sure people are going to message us again and tell me it's something they use, but I'm not aware of what that is. So to me, you have almost 50% used as Revit. So that's all the data I need to really feel good about learning Revit and going down the whole BIM modeling. And then on top of, every client, that is what they want. That's what they're looking for.
Yeah, I'm surprised actually that number is so small. I would have put Revit in the 75 area. I am looking at some photos of ArchiCAD, and it's a subset of Graphisoft, a Hungarian company.
Oh,
yeah.
Now, Max, we brought this. You asked me this question early on, and maybe I waited too long to ask you again, but do you enjoy drawing?
I do enjoy drawing, and I think that I want to do more of it, honestly. I think there's a small part of like anyone designing that says, well, I went to school for engineering and I think I'm good at it, so I should be doing that. Someone else should draw. I think that's BS. I think it makes you better at everything, and I there is still a part of me that says the people that are good at the thing should probably do the thing. And the more that is asked of the industry for BIM models, it is maybe more likely that there will be very specific pros at BIM that help put together even more involved models that maybe aren't the engineer. But I think that the engineers will have to do more and more modeling. And it's for a lot of things, like if you're totally incapable in Revit, like you're at a huge disadvantage just on a productivity side. Like you need to know how to walk through that program and get stuff done. There's definitely stuff that is probably not that efficient maybe for you to do. Like your effective speed at that is much, much lower. Even though you can do it, you can do something else way faster. And that's kind of more important, but you got to know how to use it, I think, pretty well.
So I've heard this idea that kind of the drafters are the last line, or they're really kind of the last person that gets to see the drawings before they go out the door. So they make the drawings look the best. They spend the most time with the drawings, so they understand all the nuances of it. And that's where my understanding is of the industry really holding back a little bit with the engineers doing the drafting and the design is, once you allow this kind of drafter to do the bulk of it, they're going to help kind of keep those drawings neat and tidy, at some level of quality control for that.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I mean, it's definitely, you would have to rewrite how you check drawings and, make sure an adequate amount of eyes cover each drawing. But you're right. And I think also with drafters, it's easier to standardize across even just an office, right? Because there are way less drafters typically than engineers, and they make sure everything is kind of done the same, right? If I just use different abbreviations than somebody else, the drafter is just going to write it how he writes it. He's not going to write exactly what I wrote. So he's kind of this funnel that makes everything a little more streamlined and look like everything else. Zach, were you telling me a while ago that a project you worked on, the architect was able to bring a virtual headset to the client and walk them through the construction site as if there was a building there?
Oh, yeah. And this is being done quite often there. there's a lot of companies out there that have their own room that does this, and they have these kind of two wands and then the headset, just, VR, virtual reality. It's the same thing, and they're walking through the building. And the cool thing is architects can take the client, the building owner, through the building that way, but they can also, the contractors can also walk through the building and see things in 3 dimensions in the same manner.
That's pretty neat. I mean, I think there's a lot of little perks to this that, I don't know, make it very worthwhile having a complete Revit model. Speaking of complete, I've heard that there are different levels of completeness or accuracy or detail in a model, some sort of number system. What do you know about it?
Yeah, so you're totally right. It's called an LOD, a level of development, sometimes a level of detail. It's interesting. It's not, those two phrases are used a lot. It's not very, very well defined on the differences, but I'm going to specifically go off this Structure Mag article. It's called Beating Chaos and Achieving Profits in BIM with LOD 350. The best way to think of level of development, it is on a number scale. It goes from 100 to all the way up to 400. In between that's 2, 3, and 350. Each level adds more detail to the element that is being modeled. The example they use, which is great, and I'm going to use it because right at the second, I'm staring at it, and it's going to be hard to go away from it. A level of development of 100 would just be a square mass for a column, or even a beam. There's nothing tied to it. It's just going to be this square mass. Once as you start moving up, you start getting more details. So the LOD 200, you start seeing this beam element. Still, you don't have any modeling. As you get to LOD of 200, you now have an element in there that looks like what you're trying to get to, but it doesn't have any information tied to it. As you get to 300, it's getting to look the same, but now you have information tied to it of size and shape, material. And then as you go to an LOD of 350 and 400, which is really the top, specifically for this column, you're going to see a base plate. You're going to see anchors. For the highest level, you're going to see bolts. You're going to see nuts and washers, and really the most detailed thing ever, which would be what pretty much is out in the field.
Yeah, and that's cap is 500, I think, right? Like at the 500 level, it is basically a 3D as-built.
It's exactly what it is.
It's basically exactly this. That's the definition.
So with all these different levels, it then brings up a good question. Who is responsible to define what level we're supposed to model to, Max?
The architect often.
The
Client will do that.
So to me, none of this stuff should be scary or really we're being asked to do too much. It just comes down to talking to them. What level are they looking to have? Maybe they don't know, and you're about to come change their mind of what is even available out there and help more define what your scope of services are. And then no one is confused in the end.
Yeah, I agree.
So with all this software, Max, this is a way out there question for you. Really keep you on your toes. We just said this BIM software could potentially live update. It could potentially talk to our design software, and it could potentially detail in live sections.
Yeah. Well, what do they need us for?
What do they need us for?
Not very much, Zach.
And thank you for joining us to our last episode of the Structural Engineering Podcast.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some necessary creativity in this stuff that is hard to program out, right? But to what you're saying, I think a lot of you're absolutely right. I did see something online where someone cut a live section and everything had properties on it so that as they cut through their foundation, it could say what the rebar was. Now someone has to decide what that is, or the software can just do that. But I think it will continue to develop to a point. I think we're going to have better and better integration. And I don't know, Autodesk kind of has control over that market, right? And Autodesk does have structural software. So I really hope that Autodesk plays fairly and, allows programs like Bentley RAM, RISA to incorporate as well as they incorporate their own structural software so that you can design, create construction documents all together with as little hiccup as possible.
What do you think the limits of liability are when you do define your scope with a level of development, an LOD specification?
Yeah, getting into the higher LOD specifications, you are definitely guaranteeing more detail and probably more than the industry has been generally comfortable with providing, right? There isn't a construction document out there from a structural engineer that doesn't say, don't scale these, don't even look at them too hard. This is what the design is when it's fully constructed. Things might be omitted. There's just so much built in, and there has to be, right? Same with geotech, everybody. The more detail we provide, the higher the chance that something is going to be wrong, and inherently the more liability that we get with that. So what's my feeling on that? I think it's going to happen nonetheless. I think that's probably the same thing people said when we went from drawing to CAD and from CAD to Revit, is that we're providing more and more detail. Drawings now that probably used to be 4 sheets. When we worked together, I remember we had some school drawings from like the 70s. It's like 4 sheets of paper. That would be 30 sheets. It was a 3-story building or something. Yeah. I think we'll keep adding detail and the liability will somehow manage to stay about the same, but I don't know how it'll do that.
Yeah. And at the end of the day, we're taking liability on everything as is being the engineer of record. So it kind of is what it is. And I think as long as you have a well-defined understanding of what is being delivered, then, and you can hit that goal, then you're good to go, but not necessarily, hopefully not taking on more liability.
Yeah, I think there's always going to be, as this like technology front just continues to move, there will always be the laggard side that will say, whether it's from a liability standpoint, I can't provide this much detail, it's unrealistic, it's too much to ask of me, versus, the people that are getting out ahead of it and maybe will trip over their toes doing so. But it will continue to move in that direction regardless. So maybe it's not good to be on either side of that spectrum.
So to wrap this up, what are your final thoughts on 2D versus 3D and BIM?
I think that if you should be familiar with 2D, I think AutoCAD is a very easy program. So just you do it for a day and you'll be fine, and then put it down. Because things will, I don't think that's going to vanish. The commands aren't important to memorize, right? Like for a lot of this stuff, that's the stuff that makes you efficient, but that's not like what knowing the software is about, is like the hotkeys. So then, same thing with Revit. I think that everyone should be able to navigate, really put a construction set together from start to finish in Revit. But maybe you're not the fastest, and that's probably acceptable if you've got drafters. Because there are things that they will be more efficient at, and there will be things that you're more efficient at. And then I think the third takeaway is that the level of detail will continue to improve. The required detail will continue to increase. Staying a little bit on the front side of that is probably worthwhile. So if you've got older folks in your office that say, this was never asked of us before, this is a little ridiculous, I would remind them of their switch from paper to AutoCAD and see what they thought then.
I like it. I think that's a great way to end the episode and discussion. Now, if you guys have any more questions for us, or, really this is a very opinionated discussion. More or less, we are, I think, siding very well with what the industry is looking to do, but also is a very kind of our opinion. So if you would like to continue the dialogue with us, please reach out on email or Instagram, and we'd love to chat with you.
Absolutely. Yeah, I hope we provided some information in this episode, but I know it was a lot of complaining.
Mostly complaining. And I think everyone's got to have their platform for complaining.
Yeah, I just think we could do so much better, honestly.
At the end of the day, I just want to work really closely with all the consultants, electrical, mechanical engineers, architects. And then I also want to be on the construction side and work really closely with all the subcontractors that are building, meet with them before they go out to build, walk through stuff with them. And I think at the end of the day, we're going to get to that collaboration level in construction that makes things very smooth, and there's no room for kind of, hey, I think this is what I'm interpreting here, or and then it'd be wrong. So,
I've got one more takeaway I need to throw in there. If you're meeting with your architects for pre-construction meetings or whatever, or pre-design meetings, I would always ask if you're going to be doing clash detection, even knowing that they probably won't. Ask it every time, because it'll just keep pushing the obvious that it's an easy thing to do. There's expensive software, but Revit will also just do it built in. So it's not quite as good, but it's I think it will just continue to push all of the sub-consultants to put together better models if they know that clash detection is going to be a requirement of the project. That's my final complaint.
That sounds good. And we'll catch you guys next time.
See ya.